Dr. Stanislav Grof is a psychiatrist with nearly 40 years of experience researching non-ordinary states of consciousness. Born in Prague, Czechoslovakia, that is also where he received his scientific training. His professional career includes 7 years as assistant professor at the Johns Hopkins University and chief of psychiatric research at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, as well as 14 years as scholar in residence at the Esalen Institute. He is one of the founders and chief theoreticians of transpersonal psychology and a founder of the International Transpersonal Association. Among his many publications are over 100 articles in professional journals and the books The Cosmic Game, The Holotropic Mind, The Books of the Dead, The Adventure of Self-Discovery, and then with his partner and wife, Christina Grof, Beyond Death and the Stormy Search for the Self. Praised by such respected authorities as Joseph Campbell and Ken Wilber and Houston Smith, the astonishing deep memory work of Stanislav Grof has been attracting worldwide attention. His work has taken psychology into realms so radically new and far-reaching, they challenge our very understanding of nature and physics. Let us warmly welcome Dr. Stanislav Grof.
Good afternoon, and thanks for that wonderful introduction. And also for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to come to these conferences because of the people who come as presenters, but also very special audiences at these conferences. So what I will be presenting this afternoon is by far the most extreme and controversial part of my consciousness research, at least in mainstream academic circles. In the past, when I met in a small circle with Abe Maslow and Tony Sutic, and we were formulating the basic principles of transpersonal psychology, we finally came to a formulation which seemed very satisfactory, but there was a problem because there was a gap between transpersonal psychology and what was considered science at the time that didn't seem to be something that could be bridged. And for me, a very fortunate event was meeting Fritjof Capra. Actually, physicists from the beginning were much more open to this material than psychologists and psychiatrists. So Fritjof and I connected, and we started doing joint seminars, one-day seminars in different parts of the United States. And Fritjof took the morning and talked about modern physics and the implications of modern physics. And by the time lunch came, people's minds were totally blown because by the time people were getting Nobel Prizes for finding out that a particle moving forward to time in time is really an antiparticle going backwards in time. There were black holes, white holes, wormholes. Matter didn't really exist. We shouldn't be even using nouns because there are no objects in the world. And so after lunch, when I came with my psychedelic material, it all looked very sober and kind of down to earth. And today, again, I got tremendous help from John Hagelin, his talk, because as you will see, this is really very complementary to what he was presenting. Although his material was from hard sciences, my material is coming from non-ordinary states of consciousness. So I'd like to start by actually asking you a couple of questions. And if you find it very personal, you can just ignore me. I would like to ask you, how many of you experienced in your life some powerful non-ordinary states of consciousness? And there is a list of them. So it doesn't have to be psychedelic experiences. It could be participation in some powerful shamanic rituals or some other native ceremonies, healing ceremonies, rites of passage, some intense experiences during meditation, during spiritual practice, participation in some powerful forms of experiential psychotherapy, experiences induced by psychedelic substances, near-death experiences, or experiences that just happen in the middle of your life. You don't ask for it, you don't do anything for it, you might be even fighting it, and they happen anyway. So if I can ask, how many of you know any of these experiences? Look around. This is obviously somewhat self-selected audience, but still it's pretty impressive. Now, I'm asking because the material I will be talking about is drawn from the work with non-ordinary states and a specific subcategory which actually includes those that are listed here. In traditional psychiatry, we don't have special term for these experiences. They're actually called all altered states, which those of us who have done some consciousness research really dislike very strongly. For me, this always associates veterinary medicine. If you got your dog altered. So those of us who worked with consciousness, we like to talk about non-ordinary state, but even that doesn't really sort of meet this purpose, because there are many non-ordinary states that are not interesting from a heuristic point of view, from a healing point of view, from a transformative point of view, from an evolutionary point of view. Whereas these experiences listed here they have all these properties. So when I haven't found a special name for this subcategory of non-ordinary experiences, I created one myself, and I call them holotropic. Holos means whole. Trepein, from which tropic is derived, means moving towards, or being oriented towards. So it means moving towards wholeness, or being oriented towards wholeness. And I hope that you will get the full meaning of this as we go along. To use a kind of Hindu shorthand, I could say that this is related to the statement of the Upanishads, which is an answer to the question, who am I, or who are we? And the answer in Sanskrit is tattvam asi, which means thou art that. You are not what the Hindus call nama rupa, name and shape. You are not body-ego, as we call it. You are Atman Brahman. Your true, deepest identity is with the creative principle in the universe. So my own introduction to these states, to these holotropic states, came when I was a beginning psychiatrist, beginning to experience very profound conflict in relation to Freudian psychoanalysis, which was my reason to study medicine. I was realizing the problems, particularly with practical application of psychoanalysis. The narrow indication range, the fact that people have to meet very special criteria to be considered good candidates for psychoanalysis, and even if they are considered good candidates, they have to prepare themselves not for months but for years. In my days, it was 3 times to 5 times a week. My own analysis was 7 years, and even after years, the results were not exactly breathtaking. So I was experiencing this deep conflict. My original intention was to go to do animated movies. I already was accepted in the film studios in Prague, and it was reading Freud that somehow turned me around and led me to study medicine and then psychiatry. And just as I was experiencing this conflict and actually regretting that I had chosen this discipline, kind of thinking back nostalgically to the animated movies, this would have been a much better career than psychiatry. We got a letter from Sandoz pharmaceutical companies in Switzerland, and also a package. And the package was full of ampules, and there was a letter that came with it saying this was a very interesting new investigational drug which was discovered practically by accident in the laboratories of Sandoz. This was LSD-25. And they were asking us if we would like to work with the substance and give them feedback whether there was some legitimate use for it in psychiatry and psychology. And they suggested two possibilities. One was that on the basis of some preliminary studies, they felt that this state was very similar to naturally occurring psychosis, and that this state could be used as a kind of model on which we could study different parameters of these states, give all kinds of tests before and during and after, and get some insight as to what might be happening in the body and the mind of people who have naturally occurring psychosis. And then there was a second suggestion, which kind of became my destiny. They said that they also felt that maybe this substance could be used as very unconventional way of training psychiatrists. You know, there was an opportunity to spend several hours in the world of our patients, and as a result of it, be able to understand them better, to communicate with them more effectively, and hopefully to be more successful in their treatment. So I wouldn't have missed this opportunity for anything in the world. I kind of became one of the early candidates, and I had an experience that transformed my life, professionally as well as personally. My preceptor who got the substance was very interested in EEG, electroencephalography, so everybody who wanted to have LSD experience had to agree to have EEG done before, during, and after. But he was also interested in something that is called technically driving the brain waves or entraining the brain waves, basically exposing people to stroboscopic light or to some acoustic frequencies, and then trying to find out if the brain waves in the corresponding areas of the brain would pick up the frequencies that we are feeding in. So I had to agree also to have my brain waves driven as part of this experiment. So what this meant practically was that in the middle of my session, between the second and the third hour, when my experience was culminating, a research assistant came and said it was time to drive the brainwaves. So she took me to this little cell. I lay down, she pasted the electrodes on my head, and asked me to close my eyes, and then she brought this gigantic strobe and put it above my head and turned this thing on. And in the next moment, there was light like I had never seen in my life. My consciousness was catapulted out of my body. When I was thinking briefly about this state, I thought this is what it must have looked like in Hiroshima when the thing went off. Today, I think it was more like the Dharmakaya, the primary clear light from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I lost the research assistant, I lost the clinic, I lost Prague, I lost the planet, and I had the feeling that my consciousness had absolutely no boundaries left. I had the feeling I became all there was. It was actually part of it which was very astronomical, where I was experiencing things for which at the time I didn't even have names. So my mind somehow became the universe. And as this was happening, she was very carefully following the protocol. She started from 2 cycles, went slowly up to 60, then back, left it for a while in the middle of the alpha band, and then the theta band, and the delta band, and then turn it off. And my consciousness started shrinking again. I managed to find the planet, the clinic, then my body, and it took me a while to align my consciousness with my body again, and I was very impressed. So I decided, just because for these states it was worth it to stay with psychiatry, that I wasn't very impressed by otherwise. And so for the last 45 years, I have really done very little that in one way or another was not related to these non-ordinary states. So this involved about half of the time psychedelic research in Prague and then in the United States, where for several years I was heading the last surviving official research in the United States of psychedelic substances. The second half, Christina and I have conducted hundreds and hundreds of these holotropic sessions. We were working with the holotropic breath work. I've done some experiments with sensory deprivation, first at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, where John Lilly built one of his sensory isolation tanks. And then for several years, when we lived in Big Sur, we had a sensory deprivation tank in our garage. So a lot of people from our workshops volunteered. And then Christina and I have worked over the years with many people who had spontaneous episodes of these holotropic states, of these non-ordinary states. And as a result of our experiences with psychedelics and the breathwork, we came to the conclusion that it was incorrect to refer to these states as psychotic or seen them as signs of mental illness. And we coined the term spiritual emergency. And we were working with these people the way we would work with people in psychedelic sessions or in the breathwork, finding that if they were properly understood, if they were properly supported, that they were actually healing, they were transformative, they were evolutionary. Now, besides, I was also interested in many other areas, and the common denominator always was these holotropic states. So I've done a lot of work with shamans in different parts of the world, interacting with anthropologists, trying to find out what they have learned. I participated in some native rituals with mushrooms, with peyote, with ayahuasca, with kava. I have had a lot of contact with thanatologists and also people who had near-death experiences. We actually had a large study which was work with terminal cancer patients using psychedelics, seeing if mystical experiences would somehow take away the fear of death and if they transform the experience of dying. We found out that they also frequently relieve pain, even pain that cannot be controlled by narcotics. I had contacts with UFO researchers and have worked with some people who had alien abduction experiences, and I was also very interested in different spiritual traditions. So we spent some time around Swami Muktananda and Siddha Yoga. We had contact with Buddhists, particularly Jack Kornfield. By the way, Jack Kornfield and I are conducting retreats that combine holotropic breathwork and Vipassana meditation, actually not very far from here in Yucca Valley every year. Further connections were with Zen people, with Tibetan Buddhists. I had a chance to visit Tibet last year. And also with people from the Benedictine order, Brother David Steindl-Rast and Father Beat Griffith and so on. So it kind of became the main theme of my life, to work with these non-ordinary states and also, experience quite a few of them myself. Now, one of the most interesting things in the world of psychedelic research was the discovery that many people who take psychedelics have powerful mystical experiences. There are reports from these experiences could have been passages from the Upanishads or from some Buddhist texts, or it could have been something from the Egyptian or the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Sometimes it sounded Kabbalistic, sometimes it was like something from a Christian mystical literature. Actually, as you will remember, the first major book that was published on psychedelics, which was the Psychedelic Experience in the United States by Tim Leary, Ram Dass, and Ralph Metzner, was called The Psychedelic Experience, a manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. They found deep similarity between the experiences they were having and what the Tibetans described. Now, in these experiences, if initially we started administering these experiences for clinical reasons, we were trying to find out more effective ways of doing psychotherapy with people, getting into the unconscious faster, deepening psychotherapy, intensifying psychotherapy. To our surprise, without any programming, people started moving into these spiritual areas, and they started asking some very fundamental questions, like how did this universe come into being? Is it really possible that just matter created this universe? Could it have happened without some kind of master blueprint, without some superior intelligence guiding this whole process? What is the relationship between matter and consciousness, and the brain and consciousness? Is it really possible that consciousness is nothing but a product of some complex neurophysiological processes in the brain? And then also people asking questions about the dilemmas related to time and space, infinity, eternity, and those kinds of things. And some other questions were related more to the human condition. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? What is the meaning of our life? Is there God? Is there a supreme being in the universe? And if there is God, how is he, she related to us? So since the beginning, there has been this heated discussion in psychedelic literature about the nature of this so-called instant mysticism. What is it? What does it mean? What is the value of these experiences? And about four perspectives emerged. The first perspective was the perspective of the ultra-materialistic scientists, who were very excited about the fact that certain substances can induce what appear to be like mystical experiences. And what they basically were saying, this shows the inauthenticity of mysticism. What the mystics think are some profound insights into basic ontological, cosmological questions is nothing but aberrations in brain chemistry. There was another group of people who had very different perspective. They said, no, there is a subgroup of chemical substances that can induce spiritual experiences, and this means these are not ordinary substances, these are sacraments, these are medicines, as the anthropologists prefer to call it. So they basically used the kind of angle that you find in shamans of psychedelic cultures, who of course don't have psychedelic substances, but they have psychedelic plants, and they refer to them as sacred plants, as visionary plants, as flesh of the gods, and so on. Then there was a third, which was saying, obviously phenomenologically these experiences are very close to the experiences described in the mystical literature, but they don't have the same value. Now, the phenomenological similarity was shown by the famous Good Friday experiment that Walter Pahnke did at Harvard as a student, where they allowed him, those were the old good days, in the Harvard chapel to administer psilocybin, very similar to LSD, to a group of theological students. And the other half of them got a placebo, which was niacin, which basically makes you itch. So this was seen as kind of active placebo. And then Walter looked at their experiences and used a questionnaire which he derived from the study of mystical literature. And he was able to find out that there was no phenomenological difference between the experiences that these students had after the administration of psilocybin, which, by the way, is the active principle from the mushrooms, the magic mushrooms of the Mazatec Indians and some other cultures in the world. So these people in the third category were saying, well, they might be very similar to mystical experiences, but they are pseudo-mystical. They don't have the same value because a true, genuine spiritual experience has to happen as a result of some ascetic practices, of meditation, of prayer, or they have to come spontaneously as divine grace. You cannot force mystical experiences. So those were people like Meher Baba, who wrote this little pamphlet, God in the Pill, or the comparative religionist Zehr in Boston, who were very vehemently opposed to the idea that you could have genuine mystical experiences that would be induced by substances. Those are mostly people who did not experience these psychedelic states. They were just judging it from a distance. And they also somehow forgot that so-called spontaneous experiences described in the mystical literature frequently involve some powerful physiological factors and some biochemical changes. If you stay for 6 weeks in the desert, you will be fasting, you will be sleep deprived, you will be dehydrated, or if you'll be using some powerful physiological methods like the Lakota Sioux Indians in the Sundance, or the massive bloodletting of the Maya people. Those are powerful physiological factors that certainly cause biochemical changes. A very interesting perspective was formulated by Houston Smith, who said, these experiences seem to be identical to the spontaneous mystical experiences or those described in the spiritual traditions, but what makes a difference is the context. So having this experience somewhere in Berkeley where there was a party and there was a fruit punch and somebody, a jester came with a handful of sugar cubes laced with LSD, and people thought they were drinking punch, and they had big dose of LSD and just happened to have a mystical experience. This is very different from somebody having a mystical experience after years of rigorous practice and reading spiritual literature and so on, when they have the proper context for integrating these experiences. So many people whom I worked with, when they started having these experiences, they suddenly felt that what might have been therapy at the beginning now turned into a spiritual and philosophical quest. And that dimension almost became more interesting and more significant for them than the therapeutic dimension. So after years of this kind of work, I decided to look specifically at these spiritual experiences. And the first question I was asking, if people talk about the fact that this is a spiritual journey, is there an end to the journey? I mean, would they have some experiences or some point at which they would feel that they have gotten what they were seeking? Is there an end to the spiritual journey? And if there is, what kind of experiences could mediate something like this? So I looked at the types of spiritual experiences in psychedelic session. There was one category of experiences that people had primarily with their eyes open when they looked around, and although not exclusively. Those are experiences in which somehow the external world, as we know it from everyday life, seems sacralized. It's not the old, ordinary, nothing special material world, but it's a divine reality. You can see directly that the world around us is somehow a work of divine creative energy. You perceive the luminosity of everyday life, the way Carl Gustav Jung would put it. You can also directly experience that behind the surface in which we perceive fragmentation and separation, there is an underlying unity, that somehow the world of separation is teased out of this unified matrix. And the matrix is the matrix of divine energy, which is also conscious. So in these kinds of experiences, we can experience this dissolution of our boundaries, of the body ego, what Alan Watts called the skin-encapsulated ego. And we can experience ourselves as other people. We can experience consciousness of a group of people. We can go beyond the human boundaries and identify experientially with different life forms, all the way from primates down to plankton in the ocean. And those are not experiences that could have been somehow inspired by some NOVA program, because we learn things that the current media cannot convey. Like a NOVA program could show you what an eagle looks like or what an eagle sounds like. It couldn't give you the experience of what it is like to be an eagle. It wouldn't give you the body image of an eagle, wouldn't show you how you fly, how you work your air currents to fly, would not show you how the eagle sees the world, which is certainly different from how we perceive it. So I've collected over the years number of experiences where people identify with different life forms, different species, and came up with some surprising new information that could be verified and that by far transcended what they knew about these animals in their everyday life intellectually. You can also transcend linear time. You can have experiences of your ancestors. You can have experiences that Carl Gustav Jung called racial or collective experiences, sometimes with a sense of personal remembering, and that people talk about it as past life experiences. And again, these experiences can frequently bring astonishing new data, new information about other historical periods, about their social structure, about costumes, architecture, rituals, weapons. Again, something that transcends by far the intellectual knowledge of these people. It can even take us into the botanical realm. I remember an experience of my own when I became a Venus flytrap, and I had this fully conscious experience of catching and digesting a fly with this incredible tastes that I couldn't have conjured up in my wildest fantasies. It seemed to be very authentic identification with the Venus flytrap, with a carnivorous plant. And in many instances, people can even experience consciousness of what appears to be inorganic materials or inorganic processes. You can have an experience of becoming consciousness of the ocean, or becoming consciousness of granite or of diamond. So in these experiences, everything that in our everyday life we can experience as object can be experienced as a subjective state of consciousness. Now at this point I am a sequoia tree. There's photosynthesis happening. There is sap circulating in me. There's an exchange of water and minerals. And the sun out there is not just the physical sun; it's the cosmic sun. And the earth under me has also mythological, archetypal quality. It's Mother Earth and so on. So I can have a mixture of experiences that convey accurate botanical information, but also overlap into mythology. So this experience pretty much confirms the position of the Eastern spiritual philosophies, in which everything is really a product of consciousness. The whole world is a transformation of Brahma, or the Tao, or the Great Spirit. There's another category of these transpersonal experiences, spiritual experiences, that we can call the experiences of the transcendent divine, where suddenly we experience dimensions of reality that are normally invisible. We are not aware of them. The immanent divine, is an experience of reality the way we know it. There are people, there are trees, there are animals. Only it's a radically different perspective, or radically different experience of everyday reality. Whereas here in the transcendent type of a transpersonal experience, an entirely new reality, or realities unfold, to use David Bohm's term, unfold or explicate into our experiential field. So we can encounter mythological beings, archetypal beings, or we can become the beings. We can have a vision of the Great Mother Goddess, or we can have the experience of becoming a Great Mother Goddess, or the dancing Shiva. We can visit archetypal realms, paradises of different cultures, hells of different cultures. And again, like the previous category of experiences, these types of experiences can bring new relevant information about mythological domains that we have never studied, that we don't have any intellectual knowledge of. This is the kind of information that brought Carl Gustav Jung to the notion of the collective unconscious. We don't have just the Freudian individual unconscious, but we have the collective unconscious that has a historical aspect where we can get access to any part of human history, at least potentially, and it has the mythological, the archetypal aspect where we can get access to the whole cultural heritage of humanity. Now, people who have these experiences of archetypal beings, they have experiences which are very awe-inspiring. These archetypal beings seem to be very powerful. They're endowed with great energies. They can induce powerful emotions depending on the type of deity, whether it's a wrathful or a blissful deity. It could be, abysmal terror, or it could be bliss beyond imagination. So we discover this archetypal world, which has certain similarities with our world, but also some significant differences. First of all, it's the power of these entities that inhabit this archetypal world. The second thing is the archetypal world has a space of its own. So you can have visions of archetypal scenes that have kind of spatial characteristics. They also have a certain form of linear time, so you can see archetypal sequences. But what is missing in comparison with our world is the cohesion of these coordinates. So we can, for example, say how far it is from New York to London. We cannot say how far it is from Olympus to Shiva's heaven. We can say how many years elapsed between the French Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution. We cannot say how many years elapsed between Ragnarok and the battle of the Titans against the Olympian gods. So this is a kind of world of isolated archetypal or mythological pockets, that the world does not have the cohesion the way the phenomenal material world has. Now, people who experience these archetypal beings, they experience tremendous awe. They knew they were beings who somehow belong to a higher order. Also beings who somehow form and inform what's happening here. The Jungians are writing books like Gods in Every Man, Goddesses in Every Woman, Joseph Campbell, Myths to Live By. We enact kind of archetypal motifs in our life, or certain representatives of our culture can become channels of powerful archetypes. But people who had good sense of introspection, they would not confuse these archetypal beings with the ultimate, with the supreme. They see them as creations of a principle which transcends them. Joseph Campbell talked about it quite passionately, how important it is to keep the archetypes transparent. There's something that's pointing to the ultimate, but it's not ultimate itself. And he was using Carlfried Graf von Durkheim's quote, that deities, useful deities, should be transparent to the transcendent. They should be pointing to the transcendent, but not be confused with it. If we don't do that, if we make them opaque and we worship them, we are in the world of idolatry. And then we have religions, mainstream religions, that divide the world. They unite certain group of people around the kind of archetypal images that they believe are the correct images to worship, but simultaneously divide the world. They set this group against other groups. So in today's world, religions are more of a problem than of a solution. We need spirituality. We need spirituality that's universal, that's all-embracing, all-encompassing, not one that divides the world. You can look at India, the Hindus, the Muslims, the Hindus, the Jains. In the Middle East, a lot of the problems are motivated religiously. And even within Christianity, you have Ireland, where the Protestants and Catholics are killing each other for differences in the way they see things. Joseph Campbell used to say, kind of tongue-in-cheek, there are 4 groups that create problems in the world. Those are the Christians, the Jews, the Muslims, and the communists. And they're all groups that don't know how to read mythology. So Joseph Campbell says here, if a deity blocks off transcendence, it cuts you short of it by stopping at itself. It turns you into a worshipper and a devotee, and it has not opened the mystery of your own being. So now the most important question now is, what is the supreme principle in the universe? Or at which point did people have the sense that they really arrived, that they are facing the ultimate principle? I found 2 experiences like that. One was the experience of absolute consciousness, in which the divine is perceived as this source of light, of incredible radiance. People usually say, like myself when I described my first experience with LSD, I couldn't even imagine that light like that existed. People talk about millions of suns. But at the same time, they feel that although describing it in terms of light, you capture some significant aspect of that experience, that it also comes very short of some kind of fuller description. That it's also light which is full of, is conscious, and it has incredible creativity, incredible intelligence. It's like all of existence in an abstract form, kind of condensed. It transcends space. It transcends time. There's some similarity between this kind of experience and what the Hindus call Sat Chit Ananda, infinite being, infinite awareness, intelligence, consciousness, and infinite bliss. Now, we can experience this state in 2 different ways. We can simply witness it. We can sort of become observers, but we maintain the subject-object dichotomy. We can assume a filial relationship. It's like a father. It's like a mother, great father, or a lover, the way Teresa of Avila experienced the relationship to God. And this would be an experience that the Kundalini yoga would associate with the 6th chakra. But there's also the possibility of absolutely dissolving the boundaries and identifying, becoming that source. Sri Ramana Maharshi wrote once about a sugar doll, when he was describing this experience, but a sugar doll that went for a swim to the ocean and completely dissolved in the ocean. And Ramakrishna, who was a bhakta, responding to this, said, I want to taste sugar, I don't want to be sugar. So those are the 2 different ways in which we can experience this supreme principle. Now there's another way of experiencing the ultimate, which is actually the experience of the void, the kind of primordial nothingness, emptiness, yet emptiness that's full of potential. It also transcends time, transcends space. There is consciousness that is aware of the fact that there is nothing concrete there, but also aware of the fact that there is a potential for all of creation. So it's a vacuum that's a plenum at the same time. And there are concepts today in modern physics that come very close to it, like the concept of the dynamic vacuum. Or David Bohm computed that in 1 cubic centimeter of vacuum there's more energy than in the entire visible universe. Of course, when physicists talk about this dynamic void, they only talk about the origin of particles, the source of what we perceive as the material world. Whereas in our experience of the cosmic void, or supracosmic, metacosmic, as some people call it, there is more to the world than the material that it's made of. There is the logos, there is the idea, the concept, there is form, there is order. So this, the creation would come out of the void with all these different aspects, not just, it would not be just a source of the material substance. So again, the void would transcend all polarities: dark, light, good, evil, feminine, masculine, and so on. Now, the most surprising about this kind of experience is that when we have that experience, we recognize that we, in our deepest identity, we are that creative principle. We are divine. We are coming back to the tattvam asi, thou art that. You are not nama rupa, you are not body ego, you are the divine, whichever name you use for it. And we have some examples from different religions. I already mentioned the tattvam asi of Hinduism. In Siddha Yoga, they say, God dwells within you as you. In the Buddhist scriptures, it says, look within, you are the Buddha. In the Confucian tradition, heaven, earth, and human are one body. Jesus said, Father, you and I are one. Saint Gregory Palamas said, for the kingdom of heaven, nay, rather, the king of heaven is within us. A Kabbalist, Abraham Ben Shemi Abulafia, said, he and we are one. Muhammad said, whoso knows himself knows his Lord. And Al-Halaj was burned for his statement, An al-Haq, which means I am God, I am the absolute truth, the true reality. So that's a very, very interesting finding. You see, a very radical redefinition of who we are, and this is not a belief, but this is an experiential reality. Now, one of the things that you find is that people find it very difficult to talk about this experience, that we have developed our language to communicate about everyday things, at least in the industrial civilization. And somehow the words, but even the structure of language is somehow inadequate to convey, although people try to describe it, but they usually complain about the ineffability of these experiences. Lao Tzu said about it, the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao, the name that can be named is not the eternal name. So some of the more sophisticated people who have read spiritual literature, they use words from cultures that had much more experience with non-ordinary states than we have, and actually have specific terms for some of these things that they experience. So they use Sanskrit, Tibetan, Chinese, or Japanese terms. They talk about samadhi, or the more sophisticated one, even specific forms of samadhi, nirvikalpa samadhi, samikalpa samadhi, and so on. They distinguish between kensho and satori. They talk about nirvana. They talk about kundalini, ki or chi energy. They talk about the intermediate state between birth and death. The bardos, they talk about samsaric world. They talk about maya, or the concept of anatta, which means there is no separate self, some of the basic concept of Buddhism. And other people quote poets and saying that somehow the language of poetry is much more appropriate for conveying some of these experiences. So they would bring Omar Khayyam, Mirabai, Khalil Gibran, D.H. Lawrence, Rainer Maria Rilke, and so on. And they frequently say that now they understand, after they had the experience, they understand these poets much better than they did before. And of course, they understand much more what the mystics are talking about when they are describing their experiences. Now, then, one interesting thing is that when we have this experience of this supreme principle, it becomes clear to us that this is the source of creation. This is somehow the author of all the phenomenal realities, whether it's the archetypal reality or whether it's the material reality. It also becomes clear that what this principle can create is actually experiences. All these phenomenal worlds are made of experiences. They are what we call these days virtual realities. And we heard today that actually this insight converges with modern physics, where modern physicists going deeply into matter, they are finding less and less until on the subatomic level we end up with equations, with probabilities, where there's no more stuff left, no more something that we would in everyday life call matter. So the universes are created from experiences, and the semblance of materiality is really an illusion. This is what the Hindus call Maya, and this becomes clear to people who have the experience of this source. They're very frequently, this is associated with insights why creation happens. We have the sort of the creative principle in its undifferentiated form, and then we have all these other worlds. And then we ask the question, why does the divine bother to create? It's a lot of work, to create all these different universes. And the answers seem to fall into two categories. Some of these insights emphasize the incredible abundance, the richness, the creativity. I mean, this source is so full of potential, so creative that it cannot contain it and has to kind of give it out. The way a good artist on our level who has inspiration, you see, feels tremendous urge to create, to put it out. Another thing that you hear is that there's this incredible potential within this source, and there's a need to get to know itself. This is what you find in the Kabbalistic scriptures. When they talk about the motive for creation, they say, face wants to behold face. God wants to see. God wants to get to know God. Some people talk about this incredible curiosity that the universe is really this incredible experiment. Other people talk about it being this incredible piece of art. Materialistic science just described the fundamental building blocks, but it never addressed the idea of where does form come from? How come there are so many animal species, so many different people, races, languages, so many different landscapes, and so on. So suddenly an insight comes that this is a creative act. This is there's an artistic aspect about the universe that materialistic science cannot account for. Sheldrake was the one who pointed out in biology that we really don't have in current science adequate explanation for forms and creation of forms. It talks about the morphogenetic fields and so on. The second category of insights actually points to something that's missing, some lacks, that the divine is actually seeking something in creation that it doesn't possess in this undifferentiated form. The most common insight is that it has something to do with loneliness. That as incredible as this experience is, there is a sense of loneliness. There is a tremendous need for sharing, for communicating, for partnership. And this can happen only by creating systems that involve subjects and objects. There is another category, very frequent insights, that it has something to do with love, with the need to give love and to receive love. That is impossible in this sort of undifferentiated state. Another thing that you hear very frequently is that the source, the creative source, is seeking certain characteristic that it doesn't have. So it's eternal, it's infinite, it's ethereal, and that it's looking for something concrete, something tangible, something impermanent, something material. Now, this has been expressed in the famous Codex Borbonicus, the Aztec Codex, which has a picture that you'll see in a minute of Quetzalcoatl, who is the plumed serpent representing spirit, and Tezcatlipoca, or the smoked mirror, representing matter. And they're dancing this complementary dance. The spirit has something that the material world doesn't have, and the material world has something that the spirit does not have. Another frequent insight is that it has something to do also with monotony, that as fantastic as that state is, it's always the same, and that there is a craving for change, for drama, for adventure. Again, in the Kabbalistic scriptures, we find out that one of the motives of the divine to create was boredom, divine boredom, to overcome divine boredom. Okay, this is Quetzalcoatl on the left side in the form of Ehecatl, related also to breath, and Tezcatlipoca dancing this complementary dance. So we talked so far about the motives for creation. The insights that come with this experience also involve somehow the how of creation, not just why it's happening, but how it is happening, into the kind of mechanics of creation. Now here, people usually see two interconnected processes. The one is a process of divisions, fragmentation, differentiation, in which this one undifferentiated source is becoming many split units of consciousness, creating these different dimensions, these different worlds that we talked about, closer to itself, the archetypal world, further than the material world. And in some sense, the divine energy is pouring through the archetypal world into the material world, which it forms and informs. Now, the second process, which is closely related to it, some people call something like cosmic screen works or partitioning. Some people prefer psychological terms like dissociation or cosmic forgetting. What this describes is that these split units of consciousness go through a process in which they forget where they came from. They lose the connection to the source, and they also start experiencing themselves as autonomous, as separate from each other. So there is this complicated screen work created through which this originally unified field is fragmented. And we get this sort of complexity of worlds that seem to be inhabited by a number of beings on our level, many people, many races, many speaking many languages, being in many countries, many animal species, and so on. Now, the interesting thing here is that somehow the creation happens so that the divine source creates within itself and from itself. And it creates in such a way that each part somehow continues to contain the whole. This is something that we could not imagine before the discovery of optical holography, when the mystics were saying, I am just an insignificant part of the universe, but I'm also the whole thing. The usual answer would be, so what are you saying? Are you part or are you a whole? It says you're violating Aristotelian logic. So also the mystical system, the esoteric system is talking about the human being a microcosm that contains the macrocosm, as above, so below, as without, so within. So these things did not make any sense until the discovery of holography. But long before the discovery of holography, this could be experienced internally in non-ordinary states. There's a beautiful image of this in the Avatamsaka Buddhism, or the Hawaiian Buddhism. This is the Chinese version, where an empress couldn't understand this system of mutual interpenetration that is described by Avatamsaka Buddhism. You might know the image of the pearl necklace of the god Indra, which is or arranged in such a way that each pearl reflects all the others. That's an image closely related to Avatamsaka. So this was an empress who couldn't understand what this form of Buddhism was about, and it describes a sage, Fatsang, to whom she went for advice. And he took her to a hall like this, which was all mirrors on the walls, mirrors on the floor, mirror on the ceiling. And he brought a candle and lit a candle in the middle, and suddenly there were millions of candles all over the place. And then he reached into his pocket and he took out a crystal, and then all those candles were suddenly collected in this crystal. And he said, this is how it is, one in many, many in one. But this is a very primitive way of showing. It's much more complex, but this is the best I can do. Okay, so we have some of the images from esoteric literature. This is the Hermetic human, which is the cosmic person, the idea that an individual human being in some sense contains the whole universe. This is a parallel from the Kabbalistic literature. This is Adam Kadmon, again a cosmic person. This is from Tantra, where it is called Purushakara Yantra, which is the image of the human being. That circle in the middle is the realm where we live, and then above those are the supernal, the celestial realms, and below are the underworlds. And the idea is that we can, in non-ordinary states, experience that basically the whole universe, not just the different aspects of the material world, but also the archetypal world in its supernal form, as well as the underworld. And this image, very similar tantric image, uses that scene from Bhagavad Gita, where Arjuna wants Krishna to show himself in his divine form, and then he unfolds into this cosmic person. But again, the reality behind it is that this is true for each of us. This is not just Krishna. Each of us is ultimately a cosmic person. We go until 6, yeah? Okay. 6 o'clock, yeah? Okay, so this, what we described so far, is just one half of the cosmic cycle. Now the insights are that there is also the other side of the cycle, which contains equally rich spectrum of opportunities for return from this cosmic forgetting, from this alienation, the system of experiences through which in different degrees our boundaries dissolve and we can become a larger and larger unit until ultimately we can experience ourselves as divine itself. We can completely return to the source. And I have some terminologies that other people used. In Plotinus, it was called efflux and reflux. Aurobindo talk about involution of consciousness and evolution of consciousness. Ken Wilber calls it descent and ascent. And I already mentioned the term that I have been using, holotropic for the movement towards the source, and holotropic for the creation, for the cosmogenesis, which means oriented towards the world of matter. Now, there are many, many different ways, many different triggers for these experiences. So, the so-called technologies of the sacred, the technologies developed by different native cultures, by different ancient cultures, to induce non-ordinary states that they were using in the ritual spiritual practice, which is drumming, rattles, dancing, breath, psychedelic plants, physical pain, sleep deprivation, fasting, stay in the desert, stay in a cave, and so on. Some experiences from everyday life. Many women have these experiences during delivery. It can happen in some great lovemaking. These kind of unitive experiences can happen between the mother and the child, the fetus or the child who is being nursed. There are spontaneous mystical experiences. As such, there are also spontaneous mystical experiences that are very difficult, which Christina and I call spiritual emergencies, really challenging, frequently disturbing, at least in some stages. And there are two ways of entering this world. One is the ego death. When you read mystical literatures, some of the mystics were in a situation of the dark night of the soul, where they felt the end of the rope, they were on the verge of suicide, and suddenly there is an opening into the spiritual experience. The other one is the ego dissolution, when there is no pain, there is no struggle, but the boundaries dissolve. So you might be on a trip down the Grand Canyon, and suddenly your boundaries are melting. You become the raft, and you become the Colorado River, and the geological formations, and the clouds and the sky. This can happen. Some beautiful pieces of architecture in a Gothic cathedral. This can happen in Taj Mahal. This can happen in performing art or witnessing some great art form, and so on. Maslow talked about peak experiences here. So those are all the ways to reunion. I have Teilhard de Chardin's quote that kind of captures this, our own identity with the spiritual world. We are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are divine beings having a human experience. Now, another interesting question that people face in non-ordinary states is, if it is true that our true nature is divine, how come we opt for this? What is it that kind of tricks us into believing that we are these limited material bodies living in a material world? Now, the best answer I have heard from quite a few people, actually, independently over the years, is that the divine traps itself by its own perfection. Now, we talked about the different kind of motivations why the divine has to create this world with material characteristics. Now, if you go to a movie or you go to a theater play, the better it's done, the more we get lost in it, the more we tend to respond to it as if it were real. Now, the idea would be that this would be conducted, performed with such perfection, all the loopholes would be covered, that it becomes almost believable. You really have to try hard to extricate yourself from this illusion. It's very believable. It's extremely well done. So this is what Alan Watts called the taboo against knowing who we are. The Buddhists talk about it as avidya. sort of fundamental ignorance about our own nature, about the nature of reality. The Hindus talk about Maya. We are kind of all entangled somehow in these snares of Maya, sort of believing that we are material beings living in a material world. Now, the other thing that I have heard repeatedly is that what makes this world so believable is the existence of the trivial, of the banal, of the ugly. I remember one scientist, we had a LSD program for scientists where people could come for our inspiration, scientific inspiration. And I sat for a man who just had an insight into the universe being lila, being the divine play, the way the Hindus talk about it. And was asking this question about the taboo against who we are. And he says, I understood now the function of the banal and the trivial and the ugly. He said, if we were these ethereal beings sort of floating in the air and taking the energy directly from the sun, and we would be surrounded by beautiful natural sceneries. There would be the Himalayas, and there would be a sunset over the Pacific and an aurora borealis, and we are listening to Beethoven's music, and that's surrounded by Michelangelo's sculptures. It would be all too obvious that this is a divine realm. So what do we have? Baltimore, these miles and miles of ugly houses where people live their ordinary lives, all these physiological functions, snoring, burping, passing gas, obscene graffiti, toilets and so on, junkyards. So the divine, the obviously divine, is just given in these little dosages, and there's a lot of this ordinary stuff that it becomes very implausible that the divine would bother to create something like that. Okay, now there are some other obstacles for our ability to see the creation as divine and ourselves as divine. One of it is the kind of predatory nature of nature. So we have some statements here. Antony von Leeuwenhoek, who was the discoverer of the microscope, looked into the microscope and showed that even in the micro world, everything was eating everything else. So he said, life lives on life. It's cruel, but it's God's will. Alfred Lord Tennyson said, nature is red in tooth and claw. Then we have the biologist, George Williams. Mother Nature is a wicked old witch. Marquis de Sade was referring to nature when he wanted to justify his sadomasochism, or sadism actually. Alan Watts wrote a very interesting article for the Playboy magazine called Murder in the Kitchen, showing that life lives on life. If you are alive, you cannot be alive except this being at the expense of another life form. So the solution for him was to do it with reverence, with gratitude, the ways the native cultures do when they kill a deer, the Huichols kill a deer, there is a ritual on Thanksgiving and so on, and apologies. And Joseph Campbell, again, tongue-in-cheek, had a definition of a vegetarian. If you think that vegetarianism helps to escape this dilemma, he said his definition of a vegetarian was a person who was not sensitive enough to hear a tomato scream. Okay, the other major problem is not just the aggression found in nature, which is kind of clean. It's done for food, for hunting, it's done for maybe sexual competition, defending the territory. But then we have what Erich Fromm called the malignant aggression. Incredible sort of human aggression, absolutely unnecessary, really kind of a bestial. So the existence of this kind of malignant evil in human beings, but then we can go to the other level and we see that the archetypal level is dichotomized. I mean, there are dark deities that clearly are responsible. Their energy is kind of leaking and it's forming and informing the evil manifestations in the world. So there's a dark side of creation. Another problem would be the dogmas and the activities of organized religions. Carl Gustav Jung used to say that one of the main functions of organized religion is to protect people against the experience of God. And Walter Houston Clark, a very well-known professor of religion who wrote a book on the psychology of religion, and then 25 years later had a powerful mystical experience and suddenly understood what he was talking about, or had been talking about all the time. He used to say later that much of organized religion reminds him of vaccination, that you go to church and you get a little something that then protects you against the real thing. You are made to believe that all you have to do is to show up in church on a Sunday, and you're critical of the neighbor who didn't show up there with his kids. And that's all you have to do, and that, of course, would effectively block any kind of attempts at deep self-exploration in which you would discover your own divinity. Christina, in her book, The Thirst for Wholeness, talks about the fact if the genuine divine is really within, then how toxic all those statements are that we hear frequently from organized religion. She's describing how in the Episcopalian Church they had them sing, there is no health in us. We are miserable sinners who don't deserve crumbs from your Lord, from your table, O Lord. So this would be effectively preventing you to find this kind of a form of divinity. It would not be a very helpful religion. Okay, the other thing is that there are all kinds of pitfalls. I mean, the spiritual path, the way to reunion is fraught with tremendous dangers, with tremendous obstacles. Part of it is the nature of the experience itself. You know, the experiences can be pretty scary, particularly if we are, for example, approaching the ego death and we feel that this is going to be death. It's going to be end of our existence, or we encounter some powerful demonic presences, which is actually very common just before a major opening. The ego death rebirth itself is that kind of a sequence going into really powerful darkness, meeting demonic presences, and then the opening. This is mirrored in Japanese temples. I don't know how many of you have been in Nara. Anybody? Yeah, there's a beautiful image of the Buddha, the largest bronze sculpture in the world. And when you walk into the temple, there are these two horrifying guardians. So you have to sort of face them, and then you walk into it, and then it opens up into this incredible vista of the Buddha image. So the experiences themselves involve frequently fear of death or fear of insanity, or never coming back from that. So it's not an easy journey all by itself. But then we have the external influences. So in Middle Ages, many people who had these kinds of experiences ended up with the Inquisition, ended up in the auto da fe. It was the Holy Inquisition that was making the decision which experience was okay, which was not. The very few lucky ones, were raised to sainthood, but thousands of others were not so fortunate. You can have the capricious example of Joan of Arc, who was burned at a stake. Then 25 years later, the sentence was changed. She was acquitted. And then 500 years later, she was canonized. Now, we don't have the Inquisition today, but we have psychiatry. So people who have these experiences tend to get a diagnosis. We don't have a distinction between a mystical, spiritual experience and a psychotic experience. And the diagnosis is for life. If you have just one experience like this and you get diagnosis, for the rest of your life you are seen as psychotic. Even if you don't have any other episode, you are psychotic in remission. Just the fact that you had one experience like that is enough. And we had, until not so long ago, when I was a beginning psychiatrist, we still had insulin shocks, we had electroshocks, we had cardiazol shock, and the treatment was not that far from the treatment of the Inquisition at that time. Sufism, for example, in many Islamic countries is a very, very problematic role. The Sufi zikrs are forbidden in some of them and so on. There has been quite a bit of persecution. Now there's the whole area of psychedelics, which are called entheogens. You have a fairly good possibility of, if you do it under good circumstances, to have a spiritual experience. But as soon as it appeared, it was counterbalanced by the fact that it became illegal. There was a chromosomal scare. There was the flashbacks and possibility of ending up in a psychiatric hospital. So it just kind of made the cosmic game a little denser, a little more interesting, but it didn't provide an easy escape. Sexuality, under best circumstances, has tremendous spiritual potential. We see it in Tantra, but then again, it's the counterbalance to it is the whole spectrum of pitfalls to sexuality as a very powerful instinctual drive. Okay. Well, let me quickly go into the problem of good and evil, which is something that is a very, very difficult, very challenging issue. It's one of the most difficult issues on the spiritual path is to be able to embrace creation in an affirmative way, including the dark side, because it has the dark side, as I talked about it. So people who come to terms somehow with the existence of the dark side, they usually see somehow that it has a necessary role in creation. First of all, creation is what we can call creatio ex nihilo, which is creation out of nothing. And so one of the insights is that it has to be symmetrical. Again, we find it in physics, in the clown chamber. We see that pairs of particles and antiparticles are created. There are cosmologists who believe that at the beginning, in the Big Bang, the equal number of particles and antiparticles were created. But a more common insight is that it somehow gives a tremendous depth and richness to this cosmic game. They once asked Ramakrishna, Swamiji, why is evil in the world? And he thought for a while, and then he said, to thicken the plot. And when I first read it, I said, thicken the plot? I mean, what are we talking? We're talking about little children, dying of cancer. We're talking about napalm. We're talking about Hitler, thicken the plot. But then when you think about it, there's something to it. Tev Sparks, who's a very good friend of mine, and he leads now our training, holotropic training. He is a great fan of movies, and he's working on his sixth screenplay. And once he gave me a manual how to write a screenplay, and it began telling you that if you want a guaranteed flop at the box office, you make a movie about life in a happy village where there are no problems, nothing ever happens. So I have here the kind of a mental experiment that you can do. If we eliminate everything out of the cosmic game that we consider to be the dark side, something that we would rather not see, and you start, let's say, with diseases. So we take out diseases. There have never been diseases. Nobody has ever been sick. Now, we cannot do it in an isolated fashion. We also automatically lose the whole history of medicine, all the people who sacrificed their lives, all the heroes, the pioneers, the Virchow's, the pastors, and so on. We use the physicians, lose the nurses, the Good Samaritans. Mother Teresa was her Nobel Prize, and so on. So we lose a lot of what we value. We can look at the even more obvious thing, which is violence. So let's say take violence out of the cosmic game. Nobody has ever been, everybody was always nice to each other. Now we are also losing a lot. So we lose all these freedom fighters, all the triumphs of victories over oppressive regimes. We lose all the intelligence that went into development of weapons over the ages, but also the defense against weapons. We lost all the fortresses, all the medieval fortified castles, all the museums, that show weapons and uniforms. But we also lose a lot of art. There would be not much left of the Hollywood archives. A lot of good art, paintings, sculptures, music would disappear. Also, absence of metaphysical evil would reduce very much the function of a religion. God would become kind of a guaranteed commodity, and so on. So if we do this kind of mental experiment, we start seeing that was not such a unrealistic sort of assessment what Ramakrishna did. But it remains a big problem. I mean, to really accept the full range of creation. Now, does this mean if we see the world as a cosmic game, does it mean that it gives us license to do anything we want to? It's all just a play, nobody dies anyway. Now you find out that it's much more complicated, which is to reach these kinds of insights really on a cellular level, you have to go through a complicated process in which you have to work through a lot of your own aggression. So as you are discovering these kinds of perspectives, you also lose the proneness to violence or the tendency for violence. I remember as a 17-year-old, when I was first driving, when there was a rabbit going across the street, I would step on the gas. This was like potential dinner. Now I brake for butterflies. So it's quite a difference. Then also we would have transpersonal experiences in which we discover our fundamental unity with the rest of creation. And a kind of an ethical system emerges, which is very different from the 10 Commandments or precepts. You will not do this, you won't do that. There is as was mentioned actually earlier today, there is a cellular experience. We are fundamentally one with each other, so I cannot do anything to anybody else that would not be happening to me at the same time. We discover something like the law of karma. If you don't want certain consequences, you would not be doing certain things. And then another interesting thing is that some people would say, if the world is not real, that sort of means that nothing really matters. Now you can feel tremendous compassion to sentient beings who are units of consciousness, because it is an experience that you are relating to. It's not the material that you're relating to. So these kinds of insights actually paradoxically increase compassion or a sense of oneness and sense of responsibility and sense of service and so on. Okay, I will just take this one as the last one. So we have seen is kind of an image of the cosmic drama in which we have two movements. One is the movement from the undifferentiated cosmic source into the world of matter, the holotropic movement, and then we have the movement from the world of matter back to the source, the holotropic movement, the ways to reunion. Now, in many religions, there's the idea that this is a low level, this is the garbage level, this is the valley of tears. It's somehow, fundamentally polluted. It's the quagmire of death and rebirth, and we want to get into some other better realm. You find it in Christianity, certainly very negative attitude towards nature and sort of a lot of aspiration for the transcendental. You find it in the initial Hinayana Buddhism, where the idea was, as long as you are entangled in the world, it's suffering. You want to move into nirvana. Nirvana is related to vata, which means wind. So it's the extinction of the torches of life. It's evanescence and so on. Now, those people who have the experience of getting back to the source of samadhi, they find there's a problem, because it is not just the goal of the spiritual journey, but it's also a source of creation. So if that experience would be self-fulfilling, the idea is that creation would have never happened. The divine would not have sought the creation. It would just exist in that undifferentiated state. So in this kind of insight, the creation of the phenomenal world becomes a necessary complement. So that when you are in the undifferentiated state, the movement is toward creation. If you end up here as a separate being, you are dealing with the problems of death, impermanence, aging, and so on. And so there is tremendous need again to go back to the undifferentiated unity. So there is no really solution on either side. We have two in creation. We have two movements that go against each other. So the question now is the $66,000 question is: what is an intelligent adaptation to this situation where there is no fulfillment on either side? So the people whom I have seen, who found some satisfactory solution, they basically embrace this level. You have to accept that this level is a valid level. It's equally divine. It has something significant to offer. This is the only level where we can fall in love, where we can have children, when we can go scuba diving, skiing, where we can eat bouillabaisse, listen to Beethoven's music, fall in love, and so on. But if we are experiencing it from a perspective when we think about ourselves as just material beings, as body egos, it's fraught with tremendous problems of the impermanence, aging, death, and also what Ken Wilber talked about as the Atman project, that we're trying to actually realize our divine identity through the limitations of the material world. But it's impossible, because we would have to be it all and have it all to come close to our true identity. The only realization can come through inner experience of one's own divinity. So the recipe then seems to be to complement what we do in everyday life by some systematic self-exploration. This is what Jung also suggested, that whatever we do in the world should be complemented by some intense self-exploration in which we draw on the wisdom of the self, what he called self with capital S. We draw on the wisdom from the collective unconscious. And we live our life in such a way that it's a synthesis of what we know from our everyday life, but what we also discover in these holotropic states. And we live our life as a synthesis. So this makes it possible then to experience fully whatever this life brings, experience what Zorba the Greek called the whole catastrophe, But when things get really heavy, we have this large meta-framework which we have created in this inner self-exploration, when our own identity is radically redefined, when we know experientially on a cellular level our own divinity, and we can sort of resort to it when things get very, very difficult. So I have used my time. Thank you for your patience. And